Lord, come and make your home with us at this point in our time, in our service together. Help us to feel your presence sitting beside us and wrapping your arms around us. And help us to hear the words that we need to hear so badly this day, whatever the word is. For the sake of Jesus. Amen. So I'm going to ask you if we remember that movie E.T. and he's saying home.
Yeah.
Home. Remember that? If we were to explain what home meant to an E.T., what are some of the words that we would say?
Safety.
Safety. Comfort. Where your family is. Others?
Warmth.
Warmth, yeah.
Sanctuary.
Sanctuary.
Love.
Love. I want you to think about all of those things that make you feel, I'm home.
Peace.
Peace, yeah. Okay, good. Marcus Borg, in his book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, he speaks about the importance of storytelling and how there are macro stories in the scriptures that we have to remember in order to connect the gospel to the Hebrew scriptures and that connect us, our own story to those stories. And he basically says there's 3 types of stories. One isn't really a story, but it's kind of a theme in the scriptures. The first of the stories is that about the Exodus, calling us from bondage into freedom. It's a journey story. And so we have songs, journeying songs, one more step along the way I go, and that kind of walking song, right? So we have the journey songs, and the Exodus is that macro story, calling the people of Egypt, or people of Israel, out of the bondage of Egypt into a new land. The second macro story is that of exile and coming home. During the Babylonian exile, the people of Israel were taken away from their home, and then they were brought back. And there's a lot of prophets that speak to returning home. So that's the second macro story. And the third macro story is really not a macro story. It's the priestly tradition. It's how do we move from moving from guilty sinner to the redeemed or the forgiven people of God. So it's a purity story. It's the institutional story of how the role of the priests help us to move from one state to another. They're movement stories. Today we're going to focus on the Exodus, or the exile and the return home story. The second story, or macro story. The first is obvious, perhaps. You have to leave home in order to return. Isn't that obvious? You have to leave in order to know what it means to return home. And for some of us, leaving home is a matter of choice. Choosing where to go and what to do with your life, what type of person you wish to be, this is part of that story. And that can be liberating no matter what type of context you come from. It can be a very exciting time to leave home and to set out. But for those who grew up with abuse, it means breaking free of home, getting out. But more, it's about moving from being a victim to being free. And that's making your own decisions and having more control. So getting away from abuse and taking responsibility for your own relationships and how you're going to engage with people. And again, leaving home can be freeing and life-giving. But that part of leaving home is really not an exile and return home. That's more an Exodus story, isn't it? It's moving from bondage into freedom. So that's kind of not the same for me. I wanted to address it that there are abusive situations and it's a good thing to leave home. But that's not really the return home I'm thinking about. I'm thinking more about those people who would love to go home, where home is a good thing, a positive thing. And I acknowledge that that's not always the case. So today we're going to focus on the exile and the returning home. For the people of Israel, this exile was imposed. It was a forced evacuation of all who maintained the social, political, and religious or spiritual structures of the people of Israel. And it included the destruction of the temple. It meant that you could no longer smell the honeysuckle outside your back door. It meant that you couldn't go to the stores and the shops where you used to know who had what and when the things would be in season. It meant that you couldn't watch the tree that you planted at the birth of your first child. You couldn't sit beside that tree. It meant that all the roles that you used to have, like taking flowers to your elderly neighbor, or being the one to fix the plug sink for your neighborhood, or bringing your most well-known and well-loved recipe to the community festivals. It means being cut off from all of those roles, and the whole world is in disarray. And the focus is on survival. This story is a common one in our society, isn't it? It's a common one. I'm wondering if we could name some of those places and some of those realities that are with us today, where we see the theme of being forced to leave home and or losing one's culture. Let's name some of those right now.
The Syrian refugees and refugees all over the world.
Refugees fleeing from war, from drought, from famine. Refugees being forced to leave.
I guess people you were talking about, Lori, that are forced to leave their sanctuary or homes because of bad situations. They may not want to be part of that, but they're forced to.
Yeah. Even think people who are in exile because they're threatened, they're terrorized. I know some people that have had to become a refugee because they didn't bow down to the cartels and so on, so they had to flee for safety reasons.
So the seniors are forced out of their homes because they can no longer look after themselves.
Seniors, that's a good one. Yeah. Not one that they have to make. They have to go into assisted living or into a nursing home of some kind. It's not one that they would choose. They long for home.
Disabled people too.
Pardon me? Disabled people as well. Yeah. Yeah. Can't continue on.
The closing of shelters forces people to...
Forcing people to be homeless because of closed shelters.
Religious persecution, like you can't be Christian, apparently you have a lot of problems.
Yeah, religious persecution. Yeah, can't be Christian, you can't be Muslim, you can't be whatever. You might be forced to leave the States or whatever, depending on your religious tradition.
Or if you're like a Christian and a Muslim.
A Christian and a Muslim, yeah, in India and places like that, yeah. Persecution.
Or is that what you know because of job relocation?
Because you have to find work, and so you're forced to leave home to find work, yeah.
But if your house burns down or you're driven out to a flood or something.
Yeah.
Earthquake.
Or tsunami, or any of those hurricanes, people whose homes are destroyed. Yeah. I think about also the indigenous peoples, that they've been pushed off of the land. They feel displaced. They've had their culture ripped from them. No language, none of their culture is allowed to stay with them. So they're displaced people within their own land. They've lost their home, their culture, their sense of where they belong. Those are really good, really good. Even people who are renting and are kicked out, having to find a new home because the rents are too high or the landlord has other plans for the property. Well, whether imposed exile or simply leaving home to study or to work or to begin your own family, when we return home, we know it, don't we? We know it. Funny, when I crossed the border from BC into Alberta, I've said this to Warren, I take a deep breath and I go, smells like Alberta. Literally, we've crossed the border and that's it. But you kind of just that whole orientation to land, I just smell the prairie, you know, and I feel like I don't realize that I miss it until I'm there. And I say, oh, I miss the flatness. I miss being able to see for miles and miles. I miss that. And I even forget, because I'm surrounded by so much beauty, but you forget what home is like until you return. And then you think, oh, I remember that smell. Wayne?
Well, I can remember when I was in Calgary, I can't make it home to the mountains.
This is the darndest thing. I was in Niagara Falls, and the cloud formation was just low, and I thought I was back in BC, and I thought, oh, I'm back home. So it depends on where your home is and what you react to. Yeah, that's important. Home, though, is more than a place, isn't it? Home is more than a place. It's a sense of belonging and security and peace and comfort. It's a place where we can be ourselves without any fear. The sense of home is really what we long for, isn't it? So my question is then, how can we find it? How can we find home when we're not home? How do we experience that? Looking at the story of the prodigal son, there's a pivotal point in that story. And I think it provides us a clue how to come home when we're not yet home. And the phrase was, the young son came to his senses. Or he came to himself, or maybe he came to the end of himself. He was able to step outside of his suffering and his pride and be willing to humble himself in order to take that first step home. There is a movement of the heart and the mind that must take place for the young son. But also, I think it must take place, or it's left hanging as an option for the older son as well. He's at home, but he still needs to stand outside and come under in order to really appreciate or return home in his heart and in his mind. Perhaps today is such a day for you. I'm not sure. Is there an apology that must be made? Do you need to let go of something in order to return home? Do you need to reframe or reshape your vision or your understanding of the past? As the father was trying to do for the elder son, I think there's another view sometimes of the reality. Have you ever been around a table with your siblings and the same event holds different significance for people, or the relationship between a parent is very different depending on where you come from. And sometimes we need to have it reframed in order to understand a relationship differently. That's certainly what the father is doing with the older son, is he's trying to reframe his perspective. Instead of the poor me, which is, we can get stuck there, can't we? Poor me. Maybe the father is trying to say, look at all you've got. You have so much. You can afford to be generous. You can afford to celebrate and welcome back those who don't have anything, who have lost it, but want to return. So maybe in the Presbyterian Daily Devotion it says this, failure should be our teacher, not our undertaker. wise. I wonder if that resonates with us today. So finally, we need to hear words of welcome. Whether we have stayed in the same place for many years, or we have been gone a long time, and we yearn to return home. Maybe even to the Pharisees and the scribes, to the younger and the elder son, and to you and to me, we need to hear the words of welcome. Welcome home. That image of being welcomed with open arms. In the TED Talk presentation given by Brené Brown, a sociologist, she says that feeling connected is why we are here on this earth. Feeling connected. Of those thousands of stories that she has heard in her research, those with a strong sense of love and belonging believed that they were worthy of love. They had wholehearted courage to be imperfect and vulnerable. They had compassion towards themselves. And as a result of their authenticity, they were connected to others. They carried a sense of home within themselves. So Lent is our time of coming home, of coming to our senses, of reframing our life in the context or in the story of God, reorienting our steps and our heart to God, the Father who scans the horizon, watching for us to return. But in Christ, he sets out to seek the exile and opens his arms to embrace us in grace. So I'm going to ask just one more question. Have you experienced that moment when you were lost, but then were found? Have you experienced a moment when you didn't understand something, but then all of a sudden you understood? You saw. Do you remember a moment when you felt dead, but then you felt renewed, alive again? And another question is, what made that difference? What made you turn? What helped you change? What helped you come alive? I'm going to let you have those questions in your mind. Have you experienced a moment when you were lost, then found? Were blind, but then you saw? Were dead, and then were alive again? And what made the difference? We'll leave it at that, and that might be an opportunity for us to share